you're all very welcome to this event on empowering high-tech manufacturing to cost-effectively achieve CO2 reduction goals, hosted by CIM and in association with the Workplace and Facilities Expo. My name is Daniel Murray, and I'm a journalist with the Business Post newspaper, where I've reported on issues of energy and environment for the last number of years. I was delighted to be asked to participate in today's event because when it comes to the decarbonisation journey that so many countries are now embarking on, industry and manufacturing is one of the most interesting and one of the most difficult areas to address. Manufacturing is, by its very nature, resource intensive, and the central raw material in all manufacturing is energy. For this reason, it's a hugely carbon intensive sector, and it is likely to be the sector at the forefront of major new technologies in the years ahead. This event has come at a critical time because in the months ahead, we are going to see a shift in the legal and the policy framework that underpins Ireland and Europe's climate ambitions. The Climate Action Bill, which will embed our targets of 51% emissions reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050 into law, is moving into its final legislative stages in the Dáil, and it's likely to become law by the end of this summer. Once that is signed into the law, the Climate Change Advisory Council have told me that they will be publishing their 5-year carbon budgets out to 2030 immediately. And the government will then divide and allocate those budgets sector by sector, including to industry. This summer, we will also see the publication of the new Climate Action Plan, which will stipulate the specific actions to be taken in each sector to achieve these new ambitious targets. Minister for Climate Eamon Ryan was recently speaking to me as part of a podcast interview. And when I asked him where he would be finding all of these additional emissions savings in the years ahead, one of the areas he pointed to was industry. He said there were currently around 8 million tonnes of industrial heat processing emissions a year in Ireland. And it was his ambition to halve those to 4 million in the next 10 years. He said he expected those emissions cuts to come from energy efficiencies, from carbon capture and storage, from hydrogen, and from direct electric heating systems. I mention all of this just because it makes the point that change has now arrived. And if there's any hope of reducing emissions in the sector by 50% in the next 8.5 years, then it must start now. Of course, many companies have already begun this journey, and so in some respects, this is about building on progress to date and innovating our way into a new age of clean tech manufacturing. To discuss the risks, the challenges and the solutions to all of these issues today, we've got a really fantastic panel of experts, and they include Ronan Coffey, who is Global Energy Manager at Boston Scientific. We have Barry O'Sullivan, who is Vice President of Vision Care Manufacturing at Johnson & Johnson. We have Patrick Calnan, Head of Portfolio and Risk with Ørsted. We have Jeff Power, who is Programme Executive for Large Buildings at the Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland, or the SEAI. We have Rachel McGinley, who is Head of Sustainability with CBRE. And we have Paul Walsh, who is General Manager of CIM. I want to thank the panel for joining us today, and you're all very welcome. And I want to start maybe by discussing people's experience to date in their respective areas. And I might start with you, Barry. What has been your experience with Johnson & Johnson in addressing the energy and carbon issues at your manufacturing sites?
So good morning, everyone, right, and thanks for the opportunity. Look, I guess we've been at this for, 15 years or more, right? And a lot of this started off as cost reduction and efficiency improvement in the first place, right? Before I ever realized the carbon could be measured in tons, right? So you go back like 2005, 2006. And the first element here that we've looked at always is usage reduction, right? Way before you ever talk about alternative sources and so on. Right? So right now, today, we get all our electricity from wind power and so on and so forth. But to me, that's the very end of the road, right? The last steps and the thing. 80-90% of this is about usage reduction, right? And it's the common sense things. A factory ultimately is the same thing as your home, just on a bigger scale, right? So are we turning off the lights before we go to bed? principles, right? Basic common sense. You look at your what you're generating and what you're consuming, and you need to consume all of that. Are your lighting, your air handling systems, your air conditioning, your compressed air, your chilled water, whatever systems you have, are you able to measure what you're using? Are you able to match that with what you really need? Because the systems can be running when they're not they're not really needed, and so on and so forth. So down to the years, we'll say we started with, can we measure what we're consuming, in 15-minute intervals, basically, right, 24/7. What is our true load, and how can we optimize then, right? So, down to very simple practical things, and this is a journey then, and that you need everybody engaged. You have to engage the whole plant. It's not a game for people in the facilities department, right, or something, right? Because all they do is provide the stuff, right? This is a game for everybody, because it's the consumers who have most control, like our people on production lines and so on. So air leaks, machines running, lights on, those type of things, right, down to turning off the lights in the kitchen. So measure, engage people, match to your load, work on projects then to optimize your equipment. And sometimes it might make sense to change out older equipment and put in newer stuff. And then at the end, are there greener sources, such as electricity and so on, that we'll say that you can engage with. But 80-90% of this for me is about effective management and control and incentivizing and engaging people, both your own people and sometimes your suppliers, especially if you have on-site, facilities, suppliers, to engage everybody in the journey.
Yeah, certainly it's maybe something that's often forgotten is just how important energy efficiencies are to this whole narrative. And like you say, very similar to the residential sector where we're embarking on retrofitting programs. Why? To reduce the energy demand. And that should be the first port of call before we start talking about a more difficult option of shifting energy sources, which will happen as well eventually. Ronan, I might turn to you as well. What has Boston Scientific been doing on their plants to address these issues? And are there any co-benefits to addressing energy and carbon issues on site?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, and thanks for having us here. It's great to be part of this discussion. Yeah, I think similar to what Barry mentioned, our journey started out as a cost control journey, and it quickly pivoted to a carbon footprint control when it became clear, that energy was the driver and the main source of our emissions in Scope 1 and 2. So that led Boston Scientific to commit in 2017 to achieving carbon neutrality by 2030. And as well as that goal, there were interim goals set at that time that we needed to achieve 100% renewable electricity by 2024 and 90% renewable energy, all sources, by 2027. So since that goal was set at executive committee level back in 2017, that set in motion a whole range of initiatives that have been running since to work towards that goal. And it filters right down to site level. So, those goals apply at corporate level and to all of our sites, including our 3 sites here in Ireland. So in 2018, the Irish sites quickly pivoted to a green tariff, so procuring renewable electricity through their utility contract. And also that year, they began to implement ISO 50001. So in 2019, all sites got certified to ISO 50001 energy management system. And that really speaks to the efficiency piece that Barry talked about too. Our strategy for carbon neutrality is cut, convert, compensate. So we see energy efficiency as the primary focus of this. And our philosophy is that we don't really get the right to talk about decarbonisation unless we've got our house in order first in terms of being efficient on how we use our energy. What else is happening in that space? We're currently working on a virtual power purchase agreement that will tie us into a long-term renewable arrangement that will replace our green tariff. And also this year, there's a lot of focus on how we're going to decarbonize our thermal energy. We see that as a challenge. So putting a lot of effort into figuring out a roadmap there. Also, any new footprint we add, we're a growing company. We've got quite a pipeline of construction activity happening. So any new footprint we add, we look for it to be sustainably designed and built as per minimum LEED certification. So in terms of co-benefits, yeah, we're seeing the obvious benefits, I guess, are cost reduction in terms of energy efficiency improvements. We're also seeing increasing interest in what we're doing from our investor relations people, because externally now this is becoming very important in how we talk about and communicate this, both I'd say to our investors and to our customers. And commercially, it's seen as a key differentiator. So having a strong environmental sustainability program is very important in a competitive market. I think we're also seeing benefits in terms of sustainability rankings. 2020 saw us getting onto the Dow Jones Sustainability Index for the first time. So that was a major achievement.
That's great, yeah, and that's interesting to hear of the kind of reputational benefits, and also that you've been setting so many targets over the last number of years and reaching them. I'll come back to you towards the end to talk about that thermal energy roadmap, because I think people would be interested in what some of the options are there. Rachel McGinley, I might turn to you of CBRE. When it comes to these companies operating in this sector, of course, it's not just manufacturing sites. There's all kinds of large buildings. There are warehouses. There are large offices. So across that whole range of large buildings, how have energy efficiency and CO2 building standards changed over time? And what's going to be expected of businesses owning and running these kind of buildings in the years ahead?
Morning. Thanks, Daniel. So as Ronan and Barry mentioned, sort of over time, there was definitely at first an interest in energy efficiency in terms of reducing cost from your power bill. And then the sort of Irish building regulations have set minimum standards for energy performance as well. That's really accelerated in recent years, and particularly with the near zero energy building regulations, which really set a high standard for all new buildings in Ireland. And also the interest of voluntary rating systems such as LEED, where companies, if they are quite interested in setting a sustainability target or being public about their sustainability commitments, they're looking to deliver LEED rated buildings. But both those, sort of both NZEB and LEED are typically used as for new buildings. So I think really if we're going to meet our kind of carbon budgets as a country and across Europe, we need to look at existing buildings as well. So as well as having sort of really great shiny new buildings, we need to be tackling existing facilities as well to meet our targets.
And does that effectively mean like a large scale retrofit in the same way that we talk about retrofitting in the residential sector?
So ideally, but I think it's always case by case. It needs to be cost effective. It needs to be in line with sort of what other work you're doing. And I think it's sort of a complete retrofit is always an expensive option. So I think it needs to be done with sort of cost benefit in mind and potentially over time. Okay,
yeah, and of course prioritizing kind of exactly. Areas with large energy use. Okay, great. Patrick of Ørsted, can I ask what kind of commercial opportunities do you see in partnering up with manufacturers to power their operations through your extensive renewable energy assets?
Yeah, no, we see huge opportunities there. I suppose we'd be owners and developers of renewable energy assets, and we do the full life cycle down into supplying the electricity to our customers. So like if our customers don't need our product isn't going to go anywhere. So we definitely see an advantage in partnering with our customers and seeing those opportunities. And I suppose there's been two main changes recently. Firstly, as the others have said, there's been an increased onus from an ESG and from stakeholders to have renewable energy in their portfolios and to power their facilities. And the second thing is that renewables are now becoming cost competitive. The levelized cost of energy is coming down all the time, and we can kind of create products that can meet our customers' needs. And I suppose that's one of the things that we would say in Ørsted. we have the full life cycle. We do greenfield development all the way down to supplying our customers. We're now one of the largest suppliers of electricity in the large energy user market in Ireland, and we've structured over 200 megawatts of PPAs. And I suppose the thing that we've taken from that is that no one size fits all. We have to sculpt our products to our customers' needs, and we're happy to engage with them and bring them on that journey, because I suppose like 10 years ago, a lot of the big tech companies would have been very energy savvy in terms of energy procurement and understanding the decarbonization. And now we're seeing that other businesses now and manufacturing facilities are seeing those opportunities, and they want to come on that journey. So a lot of time that we spend is trying to highlight the opportunities to them, how to structure it, and bring them on that journey.
Yeah, great. And so many people are relying on the electricity sector to reach its decarbonisation goals, and that'll kind of filter down through other sectors then as well, particularly large energy users. Jeff, from the SEAI, we've had a question come in from the audience that I'll put to you. What are the major roadblocks to rapid renewable capacity build out, and what's being done to try and accelerate, accelerate progress in CO2 recovery solutions for things like the cement industry in particular?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. I suppose, firstly, from a bit of context, I lead a large industry program within SEAI, and that's a network of 200 members that are north of $1 million energy spend. So I suppose I see various scenarios within that, and there's probably two cohorts within that 200 entities. There's probably those that are really, really progressive and are, I suppose, challenging policy to some degree, and then those that are, in effect, continuing business as usual and don't really see the direct risk at the moment. And I suppose that's driven on the backdrop of COVID and their increased profitability and their demand and not having a long-term outlook. Then also, I suppose, a roadblock within manufacturing, and maybe some of the others on the call could testify to this also, is capital. And organizations seem to have a restriction around payback, and that restriction can be, as low as 4 to 5 years, and I'm seeing that regularly. Now, that's obviously driven more from a macroeconomic perspective, and entities looking at share price or return on investment in different areas, and it's not hindering them currently. And then I suppose another roadblock is in terms of policy, and traditionally I think policy would inform industry, and now you see industry, and that's the progressive industry, really challenging policy and looking for direction from policy in order to inform their strategic roadmaps. So I see those kind of as key pieces within the roadblocks piece. And on the CO2 recovery, I've actually had this question recently, and it's from cement manufacturers. And I suppose there is a real challenge there, and it stems really from the challenge around heat. I think one of the panelists there touched on it a while ago, but you mentioned recovery solutions, and I'm presuming they're referring to carbon capture and storage around that. And really, in Ireland, there isn't a whole lot being done around in that area or that space. Being honest, in terms of CO2 reductions, again, both Barry and Ronan touched on it. It's really around emissions reductions, and there are schemes in place such as the ETS, carbon tax, the energy efficiency obligation scheme, and various other maybe SEI supports or accelerated capital allowance supports that I suppose hone in and try to reduce emissions. And then I suppose when you're looking at 2030, I think you mentioned it there, Daniel, in technology around hydrogen and biogas, that's kind of really where real tangible CO2 reductions within those heavy industries can be achieved. Now, I know it's not there currently, but I suppose we're waiting to see that evolve, and that's, I suppose, where that industry is looking for solutions.
Yeah, I think we're waiting on a number of technologies to come through, particularly for this sector. And on the carbon capture and storage, I do understand that Gas Networks Ireland intend to get some kind of a test site up and running in the next few years. And they've also signed a memorandum of understanding with Equinor to try and actually move and store the carbon that is captured. But we'll believe it when we see it, of course. Paul Walsh of CIM, can you explain to me this idea of a CO2 roadmap and how data analytics can be a useful tool for assessing kind of your energy on site?
Sure. Thanks, Daniel, and good morning, everybody. I suppose what I'd like to touch on is maybe a bit about the experience we've seen with clients that we deal with, where they have the ESG target that they'd have to align to based on investor or ELT direction to say a site has to be carbon neutral by a certain date. And I suppose the default thinking has been that it's going to be quite capital intensive to achieve that, because their immediate head space goes into, putting up solar PV on the roof or procuring green energy. But I suppose what we're trying to challenge the clients we're working with is to press pause and to do a lot of what Barry and Ronan's company are doing, and that address the demand side reduction first, and to use a platform like data analytics to eliminate the waste. And then the next step, if you like, in the process of a CO2 reduction roadmap would be to put out some on-site generation, and the last step then is to green the balance through a power purchase agreement or something like that. And I suppose the message is, how we're trying to work with our clients is that the data analytics bit doesn't require any capital, and it can be done in a cost-effective and a fast time frame. So it can be very much a quick win on the CO2 reduction roadmap. And you can kind of gather a coalition of the willing then internally and communicate that message out to both your internal team and also to any executive sponsors that are involved in the programs.
Great, yeah, fantastic, and it's what we can measure, we can manage. So that's obviously a very important role that these analytics have to play. I want to move on and discuss this idea, the risk of doing nothing. We all know there's inherent risks in actually investing in these new technologies, because they're capital intensive, because some of the technologies don't exist yet. But there are risks of doing nothing as well. And Jeff, I might come back to you on this, because you had just mentioned it briefly there, that, among some of the companies you had spoken to, there was those who were progressive and those who weren't so progressive. And the ones who weren't so progressive maybe hadn't fully seen the kind of risk that laid ahead for them. What is that risk in your view? What's the risk of standing still on this?
So I'm mute there, Jeff.
Sorry. I think a lot of entities, probably haven't factored in the opportunity costs and are profitable currently. So, and then I suppose you look at the flip side of it, and when you look at the markets in terms of carbon, I think carbon is currently one of EU's hottest commodities. I think late last year was circa the €35 mark, and it's risen to the 50 euro mark. So, I suppose factoring that in, it's probably not at a level yet where it's directly impacting, but it will get there. And those companies that aren't doing anything, will feel the pinch. Will it be, 2025, or it'll probably come towards 2028, really, when prices rise to that sort of level where it's impacting operational cost. So that's, I suppose, the real risk there. And when you're not doing anything now, it's very hard to transition quickly.
Barry, you're in a large company, Johnson & Johnson. Has the board of Johnson & Johnson accepted that there are real tangible risks to standing still on this issue?
Oh, absolutely. Johnson & Johnson have been, we'll say, active in this space 20 years, I'd say, right? And to address the earlier point brought up around capital paybacks, for example, J&J have had a CO2 reduction fund I'd say probably 20 years, right, where they have a special amount of capital set aside every year that plants can apply for. And in Limerick, actually, we were the biggest user of the fund for many years. So you can go there, look for capital for your project, and they'll accept a much longer payback than, we'll say, normal commercial terms. Right, so J&J have had, we'll say, metrics and measures and objectives around carbon, waste, recycling, water usage, and so on and so forth. We'll say I'm in the company 19 years this year, right, and they've been there all that time. So for example, in Limerick, we reduce water usage, we'll say, on a per unit of production basis. We make contact lenses, right? So water usage per lens has been reduced by like 40-50%. And so on, right? So the J&J board is very mindful of this, right? And then if you bring it down to our business, we'll say, just in contact lenses, we'll say we have 40% of the world's market in contact lenses, and Limerick is our biggest plant. I've always been working on, we'll say, what's our message when opticians come to visit us, because we get lots of opticians from all around the world come in groups to the plant. And when they ask about, can we recycle the product? What's our environmental footprint and all of that, because their customers, when they come into their shops, are asking. So that's been a huge motivation for us. We were doing things like, we have a big geothermal cooling system in the plant, but when you go to talk to your, we'll say, opticians about geothermal cooling, the eyes glaze over. So we built a wind turbine, right? So people need to connect with what you're doing, and you need to be able to explain what you're doing just as much as doing it.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And Ronan, with Boston Scientific, similarly, there's a balance of risks here. There's the risk of not acting, but does that risk yet outweigh the risk of acting, because acting involves spending so much money on the changes that are involved?
Yeah, I think I'd say two things I'd say on that, Daniel, is the risk is very real. Our most recent materiality assessment tells us clearly that climate change is one of the 10 significant concerns for our stakeholders, our investors, our customers, our employees. So to ignore that, obviously, there's a natural risk, and we're seeing it. And I touched on this earlier. The investment community is continually and increasingly pointed towards organizations with strong CSR programs and strong environmental sustainability stories. That's a fact. We're also seeing it commercially on the sales end, where tenders of significant value are increasingly looking for CSR credentials and demonstration of environmental sustainability programs. So that's very clear to us, and to ignore and not act on that has very, very obvious business risks. In terms of the capex, I'm not really seeing that yet, because I guess our goal was set in 2017. Most of what we've been able to do since has been, I would almost call it low-hanging fruit, or certainly not a huge payback. So we haven't had to go to the business to look for significant additional funding to achieve this. Most of what we've done so far has single-figure payback numbers, and also we're able to demonstrate secondary benefits here, often in terms of improving equipment life cycles, business continuity benefits, etc. I'm jealous when I hear Barry talk about a ring-fence sustainability capital fund, and I've always been an admirer of that at J&J, but it's actually something we're moving towards this year too, for the first time. So our sustainability projects now, don't necessarily have to compete with all other capex. We do have a ring-fence fund that will tolerate longer paybacks, but will also consider emissions reductions and other benefits as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's great to hear you taking inspiration from Johnson & Johnson. Rachel, there's kind of a few people have touched on this idea of reputational risk on top of all of the other very tangible risks. In your view, what is the reputational risk to companies who don't address either their the energy standards of their building stock or the carbon standards of their manufacturing sites?
So I think when sort of sustainability started becoming an issue in industry, first of all, it was kind of a nice thing to do. It was something that stakeholders appreciated and a way of showing that you were going beyond your competitors. But as I think shareholders, stakeholders and customers have got more sophisticated, they understand more about the issues. They're definitely asking a lot more questions, trying to avoid greenwash and trying to really interrogate what's going on. And particularly in terms of shareholders or people that have a financial interest, there definitely is a financial risk in terms of not addressing climate change and not keeping up with the trajectories towards being carbon neutral. There might be assets that in the near future, if they get too far away from that trajectory, become too expensive to run, maybe uninsurable, uninvestable. So there's, as well as reputational risk, I'm sort of wanting to be seen to be in line with industry and doing the right thing. There's also a sort of interest in the financial risk of not doing anything.
Okay, yeah. And Jeff, again, back to you, to try and address these risks, we need to get these companies making decarbonisation strategies, some of which already have them. But does the SEAI do any work in this area to actually help businesses? And if you do, what kind of services do you offer?
The short answer is yes. No, a decarbonisation strategy isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all. So, there needs to be a wider picture associated with that. But in essence, the business offering within SEAI is built on, I suppose, 3 pillars. The first one is really around engagement. The second is education, and with that would be, what would form into decarbonisation strategy around training, mentoring, support, and any special working groups associated with technology. We would facilitate and run those to indicate best practice in decarbonisation areas. And then I suppose the last piece would be around enablement, which would be around capital supports, which I touched on, around although SEAI doesn't facilitates the energy efficiency obligation scheme and the accelerated capital allowance, there are other grant supports to enable a shift towards this decarbonisation pathway. But it's built really around the premise of efficiency. And in terms of decarbonisation, I know efficiency is the first step within that. And then as I think Paul touched on it there earlier, the next stage then would be around your technologies and reducing CO2. But yes, we do offer, I suppose, consultancy support to support enterprises on their journey in decarbonisation.
Well, on the energy efficiency side, as Rachel mentioned earlier, there's one thing which is standards for new buildings, and there's another thing which is addressing legacy buildings, and there may be more difficulty there. And Paul, I might come to you on this, and there's actually an audience question in specifically on it. When it comes to legacy buildings, where can you start?
It's a good question, Daniel. And I suppose the good news is that, irrespective of the building age, all buildings are generating data right now. And the challenge, I suppose, is with the legacy buildings is often they can be dealing with a myriad of old and new technologies. They can have data in silos. There can be legacy systems. But a big part of what we can do, or what companies like CIM do for people who own and operate legacy buildings, because to touch on the previous question you raised around, what's the biggest, or what's the biggest threat to the Ireland being able to achieve its CO2 reduction targets, I genuinely feel that the propensity to do nothing is still the biggest threat we face. And a lot of times the people who own and operate legacy facilities feel that, taking that first step is going to be very painful or going to be very capital intensive. And oftentimes convincing them that they can use a platform like data analytics to start that journey in a easy to implement fashion, and use the data that the site is generating to optimize what they have and to deliver more using less, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the big risk across all of these areas is the risk of inertia.
Yes.
And that's something that we see, you know, across a lot of different politics. I might want to move on now to kind of the challenges. So we've covered a few areas there, but what are the challenges ahead in actually implementing these plans? Ronan of Boston Scientific, I might come back to you again. You had mentioned earlier that, you know, you're eyeing the idea of a thermal energy plan. So what might that entail, and what are the kind of things that you're looking at?
Yeah, it's one that's very, very current and topical for us. I guess when the neutrality goal was set 4 years ago, and the renewable energy goals along with that, in the intervening years, it's become clear that decarbonising electricity, while it's not easy, it's relatively straightforward. There are defined routes to achieving that. Whereas our goal of 90% renewable energy means that we cannot ignore our natural gas consumption, which effectively is about 50% of our kilowatt hour consumption annually globally. So we need to decarbonise our thermal energy stream, and particularly in Ireland, where we're large natural gas users, relatively speaking, because we all have on-site generation through combined heat and power plants. So our natural gas consumption is relatively high. So that's a real challenge for us. Everything is on the table at the moment. Obviously, electrification is talked about a lot, and I would say is probably the front runner in terms of technology at the moment. We're fortunate in that our heat load, our heat requirement is relatively low temperature, so it lends itself towards electrification relatively easily. But everything, as I say, is on the table. We're considering hydrogen, we're considering renewable natural gas, even biomass. But to get ahead of it, I'll give you an example. We recently built a clean room in Galway. It's a 40,000 square foot clean room, and it's fully electric. So it's the first time we've done something like that. But that is really, we want to avoid adding any additional gas load that we don't yet know how to decarbonize. So this is a very efficient design using heat pump technology, and it's our first fully electric 40,000 square foot clean room.
Mm. And Ronan, we're hearing now up in Dublin that for certain, I'm not sure if you'd call them manufacturing site, but certain industrial sites, there's going to be a linking in of district heating systems, which by extension is going to end up decarbonising because less of the energy is wasted. You were talking there about your heat temperature requirements. Are they too low for your company to consider linking into something like district heating systems in your area? Is that a possibility?
No, not being very familiar with this area, but I'd say, the fact that they're relatively low temperature is a good thing, and it opens us up to more opportunity. I think the higher temperature you go in your heating systems, the more limited your options are. Okay.
Barry, when it comes to, again, making these changes, is there a difficulty and a cost in the downtime that's needed at plants to implement certain changes? Or is that something you're just very used to anyway, and it's part of the nature of manufacturing?
I think in most cases you can manage around it, right? Between annual shutdowns and, if you've got, what we call N+1 redundancy, right? Let's say you need 3 compressors and you have 4 of them. You can take one out and replace or whatever, right? So I think in most cases you can get around it, right? Buildings can be insulated. There's sometimes, you have to allow for commissioning and that kind of stuff. But I think in most cases, people practically will do these things around either major upgrades of equipment or changes of equipment anyway, or, shutdowns or that type of stuff, right? I think in most cases, right? And just if I could just for 1 second, Daniel, come back to the cost. You mentioned before the high cost of doing things. I'd absolutely agree, we'll say, with previous speakers. In a lot of cases, the costs are not high, right? And the savings, the return on investment, particularly, you know, as we mentioned earlier, the low hanging fruit was mentioned. There's a lot of this stuff that can be done that is simple once you know how, once you're able to measure. And I don't think we should get overly concerned about, you know, the bigger capital investments and that type of stuff. There's an awful lot that can be done first. And there's an awful lot of work in keeping that right as well, right? Because, you know, sometimes in terms of one of the challenges going forward is keeping the model that you have sustainable, in that everybody stays tuned in, engaged, measuring, supporting, and they don't see it as a one-hit wonder kind of thing, you know.
Sure.
But I think if you forward plan your changes and you tie them into existing business projects or timelines, you can get a lot of this stuff done, I think, you know, that way.
Yeah, well, that's good. And it's good for you to bust that myth, I think, here today, that these things are costly. There's a question that's come in from the audience, and I think, Paula, it might be best put to you. Ali Nakovi asks, if you were developing a real-time key performance indicator dashboard to measure your progress towards decarbonisation, what KPIs would you choose to put into that dashboard?
Right. So I suppose we would work with clients to try and understand what their baseline has been, and then see if there's well, I suppose the challenge to manufacturing sites is that the volume is increasing year on year. So you would come up with a metric that would be CO2 per unit produced, and then ensure that over time the efficiencies that you would be bringing to sites through a data analytics solution would reduce that over time.
Okay, brilliant. Patrick, I might turn to you again on renewables and the renewable asset portfolios that you run. Have you seen renewable or zero carbon technologies in the marketplace that are real game changers for heavy industry and manufacturing? And what are the most promising that you've seen out there?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting to hear what Ronan was saying there about the electrification. There's been some interesting reports there by WEI, Wind Energy Ireland, on what we need to hit our 2050 targets, and they said it's the age of electrification. There was also another interesting report from the IEA on a net zero roadmap by 2050 as well. And really, in the early part for this decade, they say the technology is there. The technology is there in terms of onshore wind, offshore wind, solar, and storage. And we really, on a global level, we have to increase the amount of renewables installed by 4 times. So there's up to almost like a terawatt of renewables installed. So that's one element of it. And the second element of it there, from that IEA report as well, is in terms of reducing our energy intensity. So we have to reduce that energy intensity of the products that we produce by 4% by out to 2030 to help us reach the 2050 targets out by that. So that's really to say that the technology is there. We just need the ways to implement it. Ørsted have actually come out with another interesting reports. If you have enough time for all these different reports with the World Resource Institute on unlocking renewables. And they said really what you really need, and I think some of these things go to the manufacturing industry as well, is what you need to implement these technologies. And they said there's kind of basically 5 things. Firstly, you need government policies and government targets, which we have in Ireland in terms of electrification. You need the right market structures in terms of route to market for your different assets. You need the planning and processes to be in place to be able to facilitate that. So I think that's something that we all struggle with in Ireland. You need to engage with your communities. You know, people have to see the value of this to them and to society at large. And then the 5th thing is to invest in your grid. So I think they'd be the 5 things that I would say. Like, the technology is there, and I think you need everything if you're going to hit these targets, from large onshore, offshore renewables down to the distributed, as Paul was saying there, the analytics. You know, maximize what you have currently, and you need everything if you're going to hit those targets.
And Patrick, you mentioned the grid there, which seems to be a key element to this. You know, if a number of different manufacturing sites are to become more electricity intensive or pivot more towards electrification, is that electricity guaranteed for them? Because as we scale up the renewables on the grid, we know they're intermittent by nature, but is the work being done to ensure that that intermittency is dealt with on a large scale over the next decade or so?
Yeah, well, like I think obviously there's a growing challenge. We've seen the issues regarding to data centers in Dublin and in that regard. But in Ireland, we have an energy market and we have a capacity market. The capacity there is to make sure that the lights stay on. And in terms of renewables, we're discounted heavily in that regard. So we actually don't really contribute to that market. So it's the on-site capacity that's there. So the markets are there. And I suppose out to 2030 and out to 2050, you will need some thermal fleet on the system to meet those lulls. But you know, there is markets there to facilitate that. It's just trying to get them to work efficiently is the key.
Sure. Okay. I want to move on to our last section now and talk about the solutions and the solutions to increasing the pace of decarbonisation in this sector. And I'll start with you again, Barry. What is the future? What are the low carbon technologies or solutions that you're looking at for the decade ahead as part of your decarbonisation journey at Johnson & Johnson?
Well, Johnson & Johnson is a very diverse company, right? So there's a whole, you know, we have a pharmaceutical, consumer, and medical device division. So it's everything, right? If I talk about contact lenses, just specifically, we'll say we have 3 plants, but the 2 bigger plants are in the US and here in Ireland, right? So our plant in Jacksonville, in Florida, we've just signed a contract now for to get all our electricity from next year from solar panels. Lots of sunshine in Florida, right? No wind down there, and all our power in Ireland, not just for Limerick, but all the other J&J sites, comes from wind farms. The same as Boston Scientific, and I'd say many other companies. The challenge now is going to be the heat load, right? So we don't have a biomass industry in Ireland, right? Or a biogas industry of any substance, right? And I think that's a big challenge for us going forward now. So I think that's the main one, right? And again, we'll say there's wider pieces as well around, you know, continuing to reduce water usage, recycled plastics and materials. We have a lot of other pieces in our sustainability program that we're looking at as well, right? So those would be the main things.
Okay, great. And Rachel, I might ask you, from a kind of a large building point of view, from what you're seeing in the marketplace, are companies doing enough at the moment to gather enough data on their energy performance and therefore be able to measure their decarbonisation journey?
It's quite variable. I think new buildings, like we've discussed previously in this panel, new buildings can typically be quite good in terms of the metering, monitoring and building systems that they have in there. But then as you look at older building stock, it might be more variable in terms of what information you've got. So like Paul mentioned in an earlier answer, it is a really quick win to install some extra meters and start really measuring the energy performance and usage of the building. Then without even much capital expenditure, you can just look at what you're using when and reporting on that information and making sort of those easy win improvements. But it is quite variable depending on the age of the building.
Okay, and Paul, what kind of a role then do you think building analytics are going to play in this sector in the years ahead?
Yeah, look, I genuinely feel that data analytics has the ability to move the needle in a lot of the large Irish manufacturing clients that we work with. Some of them aren't as advanced as the J&Js and the Boston Scientifics of this world, but there is a genuine opportunity for data analytics to deliver short-term, cost-effective results in terms of CO2 reduction in a cost-effective way. And I suppose, part of what we're doing within CIM is bringing clients, I suppose, showing them the value of what we do in a live environment and delivering some quick wins for them to accelerate the deployment of the data analytics and then, starting them on that CO2 reduction journey. But definitely, I do feel in terms of if Ireland has to deliver to the 51% reduction by 2030 that Eamon Ryan is speaking about, Daniel, then solutions like this will have to happen, and they'll have to be prioritised, because while the capital investment is great, it just sometimes can take years, right? Because even to put up a wind turbine now, you need planning, and then you need capital, and then you need to deploy people, and all those are very slow, right? And you're talking 3 to 5 years, best case, before you have that type of a project over the line. And in the interim, there's the opportunity for clients to be doing some good demand side reduction, and to identify that low hanging fruit that Ronan mentioned is getting increasingly more difficult, because people are doing the obvious stuff, but there is a huge amount of insights that come out of analytics when you do it across multiple data sets, and that can empower sites and leadership teams to implement CO2 reduction, but in a very cost effective fashion. And certainly data analytics is to the fore on that, in our opinion.
And Paul, you mentioned kind of quick wins there. What are the quickest wins, in the shorter term, based on using data analytics? What have you seen from your clients that are generally the quickest wins?
So let me give you an example. And this is a factory in Ireland that we found this issue just last week on. A lot of large manufacturing sites have they use a local outside weather station. So they will have a device on the roof that will be telling them what the temperature, what the wind speed, what the enthalpy in the air is. And then all plant and equipment in the facility will be looking to that device to say, okay, it's 20 degrees outside, or it's 2 degrees outside, I need to heat the building, or it's 30 degrees outside, I need to cool the building. And what we found last week is, again, the outside weather station had been placed in a position where it was getting some solar gain. So in other words, instead of it being actually 22 degrees outside, it was picking up that it was 28 degrees. And as a result, then all the chillers and the air handling units that Barry mentioned were all coming on the building to try and cool the building that it thought was running at 28 degrees, or it thought the outside temperature was 28 degrees. And that's a really quick, really basic example of stuff like analytics finds. But it does it in real time, so that, you don't see it, your chill water consumption increasing, and next thing you pick that up a month later when you see an increase in your energy bill. The beauty of doing something in real time is you can pick it up in real time, you can fix it in real time, and you can realize the savings in real time. And then you can prevent that issue from reoccurring in the future. So hopefully that's an example, Daniel, of something that people will be able to identify with. There's thousands of others, but it tends to be, in terms of the types of things we find, it tends to be operational inefficiencies with existing plant and equipment.
No, it's a great example, and it shows that you can identify inefficiencies that you don't even know that you currently have.
Exactly.
Ronan, Boston Scientific have been at this for a long while. Are there further demand side response, options for you, or do you get to a stage where you kind of hit a wall on that based on the available technology?
No, I think it's a continuous process. I call it pruning. It's just picking out the waste. It's just identifying those little pockets of waste, and the analytics is a perfect example. There's already, a huge bank of data available for most buildings. So it's just leveraging that and looking at it through an energy and an efficiency lens. You're going to continually get those little opportunities. So I don't ever see us getting to the end of an efficiency journey. And that's why I like ISO 50001, and that's why we decided to certify all of our sites by 2025 to ISO 50001, because it just embeds that into the management process, and it ensures that it's on the agenda every year, and there has to be a continuous pipeline of improvement projects, and that's well into the future. I don't see that ever ending.
Jeff, if there are people listening today who are convinced that they need to start their decarbonisation journey, what advice would you give them? How do people get started on what seems like such a mammoth task?
Yeah, well, I suppose we touched on it earlier in terms of, starting early, and I think on the premise of too small ad nib hibra, I think that's very apt in this scenario. To get started, I mean, firstly, I think Paul touched on it in terms of establishing your baseline is probably a key, and that allows you to, I suppose, carbon budget out from there. I mean, SEI is a great first port to call. We have supports for.
Oh, I lost him.
Oh, apologies. It looks like we've lost him there. I'll go to a question from the audience for both Barry and Ronan. Barry, I might start with you. A question from the audience. What percentage of your overall energy is used for heating or for cooling?
For heating and for cooling, well, they're two separate things now. So I'd say heating is probably 30%, if I had to guess. Paul, you might know better actually now, but the because we have a lot of steam sterilizers, and then we have about a 500,000 square feet building to heat, right? And cooling, then we have, I'd say it's probably another 30%, right? It's so we have, we'd say a lot of injection molding machines where we have to cool plastic and all. We have well over 100 injection molding machines, and then we have to cool the building as well due to the tropical temperatures in Limerick from time to time.
So a very substantial portion of your energy usage.
Air handling units and all that is a big part of our electrical load.
Yeah, and Ronan, same question to you.
Yeah, I would call us a light manufacturing company. So none of our processes are energy intensive. It's mainly just our footprint that drives our energy use, and it's the control environments in which we make the products. So temperature control, humidity control, air movement, air filtration is what drives most of our energy use. We group all that under HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. On an average across our sites, I'm seeing HVAC accounting for anywhere between 60 to 70% of a site's total energy use. So it's very substantial. And when we identify our significant energy uses at any of our sites, cooling is always number one and heating is usually number two. So they're the two significant uses.
Okay. Jeff, we lost you there for a second, so I'll come back to you briefly with another question from the audience. And it's something that actually we haven't touched on. Denver Flemings is asking about energy storage technologies and whether or not they've reached a stage where they're useful on site and can play a role in the carbon reduction targets.
Certainly, yeah. Again, emerging technology, and it'll probably play a bigger role when you look at curtailment of wind from an Irish context. And I suppose there is battery storage at site level. And I think recently there was also a 100 megawatt battery storage on the Irish grid commissioned. So yes, it is starting to make an impact. At the scale that it is needed, it probably isn't there. But again, it's not a flick a switch and it'll automatically turn over. It's an incremental change that is required. So it is happening and it is progressing.
Okay,
and,
great.
There is quite a number of 1 megawatt type of storages that are operational in manufacturing sites around Ireland.
Yeah, and I believe in the last 2 months alone, our grid scale battery storage, so the batteries connected to the grid, has increased by something like 600%. So a huge amount of large battery projects now being connected to the grid. Okay, well, look, that was a really interesting discussion. I think it's pretty clear from all of the contributions, that there is a real risk to doing nothing in the years ahead. There are climate targets, there's carbon pricing, there's energy efficiency targets, and there's reputational and competitive risk and the risk of lost investment. We spoke about challenges, and they're there for everybody to see. There's the challenges of actually measuring the problem in the first place. There's the availability of new technologies that we hope are going to play a big role, and there's recognizing risk in the first place. And we've heard some of the solutions that are available or that may become available in the coming years. And those are demand response, the energy efficiencies, we hope new technologies, hydrogen, biomethane, and moving towards more electrification backed up by renewables. But look, I want to thank the entire panel for their time today, and to everybody for tuning in. If you'd like to get in contact after the event, you can contact me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, or you can request my details from the event organised. But thank you all again, and best of luck to everybody listening with their own decarbonisation journeys.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye now.
On behalf of Workplace and Facilities Expo, thank you for an excellent panel discussion. A lot of good ideas in there. So I just want to say thank you to everyone. And if you want to contact any of the panel members, please do so through Workplace and Facilities Expo. Thanks a lot. And thank you, CIM, for this.
Thanks you for facilitating it. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Bye now.
See you.